video is going to be all about getting the best possible video quality out of your Canon R6, but it will work for most cameras. We will be covering frame rates, camera settings, log profiles, picture profiles, and we will be covering the biggest difference between internal and external recording, including one major flaw of the Ninja 5. That means it's going to be a fairly or even a long video, so to help you navigate and to give you the possibility to navigate back and forth, I have included chapters in the description below. Are you ready? I'm ready. Are you ready? I get a lot of questions about frame rate, and I think it's something we need to sort of straighten out right off the bat. There is no such thing as the best frame rate. Frame rates are like lenses, a tool we use to tell our story. With that said, there are of course differences between different frame rates. 24 frames per second are usually considered to look the most cinematic. Not because it's a magic number, it's just what we have taught our brains to recognize from the cinema. Cinematic. It's also the least number of frames needed to display fluent video or motion. If you don't find 24 frames per second as an option in your Canon R6, but 25, that's because your camera is set to NTSC versus PAL. If you're filming only using natural light or LED lights, it doesn't really matter if you pick PAL or NTSC. The only time I would say it really matters is if you are filming with standard household light plugged into your outlet, because PAL and NTSC varies in the hertz they send out. So if you find you have like strange flickers in your video from a specific light, that's because you are filming in contrast to PAL versus NTSC. And then you just need to switch. Just to be on the safe side, I have my camera set to PAL as I'm living in Sweden. But if you are living, for example, in the US or in Canada or Japan that still has the NTSC system, or if you prefer to use 24, 30, 60 and 120 frames per second, by all means, switch your camera to NTSC. With the PAL system, you will find you have the options 25, 50 or 100 frames per second. This video is, for example, shot 25 frames per second. If you want to shoot video that looks the most cinematic, use 24 or 25 frames per second. Camera settings for video is exactly the opposite to camera settings for photography that often transfers to manual mode, which can be a very complex matter to understand or even master. Main reason why I think videography is much easier is that we are locked in by our frame rates. So by picking the correct aperture to sort of convey the story we want to tell, all the other settings will be followed by those two choices, frame rate and aperture. So pick an aperture that transfers into the story you want to tell. Low number or a large aperture will give you a short depth of field or bokeh, background blur. It's often also what sort of refers to as cinematic. I'll add a link to a video of mine that goes into detail explaining aperture, shutter speed and ISO. It is for photography, but I think it gives a really strong foundation for understanding the exposure triangle that we will use also when doing videography. Shutter speed needs to be set to twice your frame rate. So if we are using 24, 25 frames per second, that transfers into 1/50th of a second, and that's something we actually just need to set. So when you're shooting 120 frames per second, then frame rate needs to be 1/250th of a second, as we don't have 240 on the camera. And shooting 60 frames per second, obviously 120th of a second. Even ISO is much simpler when it comes to videography, because we are often shooting in log format, also something that I recommend, but more on the log format just in a second. So when shooting long format, we need to set the ISO to the same value as the base ISO for that log profile. And when using Canon, we are using C-Log, which means base ISO is 800, so we can set that to something else. So then we have shutter speed, it's twice the frame rate, aperture is set based on how we want to tell a story. ISO needs to be what the log profile is, which means the only thing we have left to actually control proper exposure in your video is the amount of light. So that's the variant. That's also why light is such a huge thing when it comes to video. Or to put it simpler, if you don't have enough light for proper exposure, you need to add light. And if you have too much light, you need to block out light, which often transfers into an ND filter. And if you don't have an ND filter, but you should, then the only way to block out light to close your aperture and by that blocking out light. I think there is one exception that we need to mention to this rule, and that's when shooting in darker conditions where there is no risk of blowing out our highlights, typically like a talking head video like this one, where there's no sunshine and we are indoor where we control the lights. Then I think it can be very beneficial from actually stepping from ISO 800 to 400. I know I said base ISO for that log profile and it's set, but just bear with me here, because when we are switching ISO from 800 to 400, we're also drastically decreasing the amount of noise that we can end up in with the shadows. This also has a very positive effect on our post-production flow, because noise reduction is something that puts a lot of tax on your computer system, and that will make your rendering very slow. So by going from ISO 800 to 400, it can often mean that we don't even need to put any noise reduction into our post-production flow, and that dramatically increases your editing speed because it increases your rendering speed. I would say the only real downside of going from ISO 800 to 400, it will dramatically also increase the need of light. So to summarize, so give a quick recap. Set your frame rate and set your shutter speed to twice your frame rate. Pick an aperture that you think tells the story. Then you pick the ISO for the log profile, which will be 800 for C-Log 3. Then you just ensure that you control exposure by the amount of light, and you are set for perfect video quality. C-Log 2 is considered by many the best log profile for any Canon camera because it has the largest dynamic range. That's also why we prefer shooting in a log profile, because it gives us better dynamic range and it gives us more freedom to grade our footage in post-production. Unfortunately, we don't have C-Log 2 on the Canon R6, so we need to sort of go into the second best option, which is C-Log 3, and that we have on the Canon R6. C-Log 3 is a flat color profile with a lot of dynamic range. To turn on log, go into camera menu 1 and tab 3. There you find the log option and pick Canon Log 3, C-Log 3. And if your footage look like this, gray and flat, don't worry, it's the way it should look like. We are shooting deliberately in a flat profile to give us more dynamic range. Downside is that we need to sort of fix that in post-production, and that's what called color correction or color grading. So if you don't know anything about color grading and are curious, I will show you that in the end, so stay for that. There are 3 different color profiles available on the Canon R6, and let's straighten out any question marks you have. Rec. 709 is the most common color profile, and it's the most common output color profile. And that's also typically where your monitor is located, in the Rec. 709. The downside with Rec. 709 is that it's also the smallest color space. The cinema gamut is by far the widest color space. It has the most amount of color variations, and Rec. 2020 are somewhere in between. Open menu, menu 1, tab 3, you have the Canon log settings, and at the bottom you find the color space, and there you can pick between BT 709, BT 2020 and Cinema Gamut, and BT 709 is Rec. 709. I would recommend, when using the Canon R6, to always stick with Cinema Gamut because it's the largest color space, so it gives us the most option in post-production when doing color grading, unless recording externally. More on that later. On the other hand, if you're shooting something that requires a really quick turnaround, doing some basic color correction, or maybe you just need to upload it directly, typical when streaming, then I would actually recommend to stay Rec. 709. Then you can watch the camera and what you see is what you get, become much simpler. When recording externally on the Ninja 5 or the Ninja 5 Plus, you need to pick Rec. 2020. And yes, I'm gonna tell you that later. It is actually a major problem picking the wrong color profile. So to recap, if you are shooting something that requires quick turnaround, or if you don't want to spend any time in post-production, pick Rec. 709. If you want to shoot internally and get the most possible dynamic range as well as the most option to do color grading, pick Cinema Gamut. But if you're shooting like me on the Ninja 5 or the Ninja 5 Plus, then we need to stick with Rec. 2020. Personally, I always shoot C-Log 3, so I don't use the standard picture profiles, but if I had to do a direct delivery, then I would still use C-Log 3 as I would use an external recorder, and then I would use the correct color profile, and then I would instead add a LUT on my output delivery, and that way still get sort of direct delivery. But if you don't have an external monitor, or if you don't want to spend any time doing color grading, then I would stick with the standard profile, because it will give you sort of a ready image out of the camera, and that's also why I would stay away from neutral, because if you are willing to spend time doing color correction, then you are much better off using C-Log 3, as that gives you more dynamic range and can give you much better quality on your video. If you don't want to do an external monitor, if you don't want to do any type of color correction, then use the standard color profile and instead experiment based on your style eyes and how you sort of want to film and what you're filming. You might want to add or deduct some sharpness and maybe even contrast, and then use the standard. Any type of color correction, if you want to spend any time in post-production, then use C-Log 3 as a color profile. It will be much better. It should be a fairly simple matter of just picking internal or external recording, but unfortunately it's far from simple. It is a tight balancing act between almost an endless list of pros and cons. I will mention a few of the most important differences with internal and external recording. When we do internal recording on the R6, we are limited to 30 minutes. When we use the R6 with internal recording, it will overheat. The R6 can't do internal and external recording at the same time, like we could with the R5, for example. When doing internal recording, we don't have access to any important video recording tools like false colors and waveforms. On the other hand, when we use an external recorder like the Ninja 5, we get longer recording times. Not unlimited, but longer. Using an external recorder like the Ninja 5 gives us access to false colors, waveform, and all kinds of video recording tools. That's some of my sort of most important aspect between internal and external recording. Worth mentioning is that the R6 also has clean HMI output with 10-bit 422. There are just 2 or maybe even 3 major flaws with the Ninja 5 combined with the Canon R6. Shooting internally, I would use the cinema gamut every single time over any other color space. But when using the Canon and the Ninja 5, we have a problem. And that problem is an officially recognized bug that will give you a very ugly, more or less unusable color shift when using cinema gamut. That actually forces us to use the smaller color space of the Rec 2020 or maybe even Rec 709, even if I recommend the Rec 2020. The second one, and even if some creators online show you that you can get more or less unlimited recording with the Ninja 5, I have not been successful to actually reproducing that. I've tried without the memory cards, I have tried without sort of external screen, I've tried without the battery, but to be honest, I get mostly 30-40% more recording time. Don't get me wrong, those extra 30-40% can be what makes or breaks a shoot, but if you are expecting the Ninja 5 and external recording to give you like 2-3 hours of shooting, I think you will be disappointed. For me, the Ninja 5 still doesn't solve the problem that the Canon R6 will overheat. I'm not sure if I should put this in the pro or con category, but using the Ninja 5 as an external recorder, it almost forces us to use ProRes. Because I mean, one of the benefits of the Ninja 5 is the access to ProRes. ProRes HQ, LQ, or even ProRes RAW, even if I'm not entirely sure why we would ever shoot RAW. The problem with shooting ProRes HQ is the file size. It's huge. I've used the Ninja 5 for the last 5 YouTube videos, and I'm just ordered my second hard drive since getting the Ninja 5. Doing a YouTube video like this is 500 gigabytes. If I did this internally on the 265 codec that the Canon R6 produced, I would probably end up with like 120 gig. And that's something to really consider. When you move into an external recorder, you will need to stack up on your hard disk. So to recap it, if you're shooting internally, you can use more or less any color space you want, and particularly you can use the largest color space available, the cinema gamut. Shooting externally, you are forced to use the Rec 2020 when used the Ninja 5, which I would say is the most viable external recorder for the Canon R6. It's just not as good as cinema gamut. If you're shooting externally, like I do, I would recommend C-Log 3, Rec 2020, and ProRes HQ. Covering color grading in just a minute or two is more or less impossible. There are so many talented people teaching in-depth color grading. I love Darren Mostin, for example. He's using DaVinci Resolve. He's like a master. I'll actually add a link to him in the description below, because if you're using DaVinci Resolve or if you are interested in color grading in depth, then I think you should go follow him, because he's amazing. He also seems like a really nice person. I don't think you will ever watch this, but Darren, you are amazing. Back to color grading, because I still want to sort of give you some basic concept of color grading, because it's something that we sort of throw around. Fix that in post, we will do the color grading. What is color grading? When opening our footage in our video editor by choice, mine is, as I just said, DaVinci Resolve, we get this sort of grayish type of footage, and that's back to, as you now already know, C-Log and the dynamic range and the flat color profile. Let me compare it to importing a raw photo into Lightroom, because most of us have used Lightroom. You sort of need to tell the program that this is how I shot it raw, and this is how I actually wanted it to look based on the camera, the lens, and so on. That's the color correction, or sort of transforming Rec 2020 to Rec 709, because that's what the monitor wants, and that's also what we need to use when we deliver. And doing that conversion in DaVinci Resolve is actually really easy. That's by adding something called color space transformation node. And that just tells DaVinci you should interpret this footage as Rec 709 based on 2020. We could also do it manually by just increasing exposure and tint, and that's, I think it's a little bit trickier, and then I would strongly recommend that you use a color chart. And I also have a video on that, so you should go check that out. This is how I do it in DaVinci Resolve. I import the footage, I add a color space transformation node to tell it it's Rec 709, then I will add some primary just to do some basic correction of the footage, then I add my saturation node to ensure that I have proper saturation, because we need to increase saturation as it's a flat color profile. Then I add a contrast node because we need to do some additional contrast because it's a flat color profile. And then we need to add sharpness. I also like to do a little bit of quick sort of grading the artistic look. So I typically go with a very light teal and orange look. I also add glow just to tell that I sort of want a little bit of shine in the middle and shine on the skin. Add a vignette, and what I didn't actually forgot to mention, at the very first node I also add some noise reduction, unless shooting in ISO 400. And that's it. That way we have done some basic color correction to correct the footage, and then we have done some color grading to add sort of that artistic look. And that's color grading for you in like 2 minutes. But as I said, in depth, go check out Darren Mostin or any other of the amazing people that do tutorials on color grading. I really hope you got something out of this video. I know I did. If you did find this video helpful, please consider giving it a thumbs up. It really helps out the channel. Please also consider subscribing if you haven't already. It would mean the world. Hope to see you in these ones or in the next one. Until then, take care, stay creative. Bye bye. Hey do.